Good morning again. My name is Matthew. I'm one of the pastors here. I want to invite you to grab your Bible, and we're going to be in the book of Genesis. We're actually going to cover two chapters, Genesis chapter 40 and Genesis chapter 41. And I'm going to do things just a little different that I normally do. I'm going to kind of narrate some of the stuff that's happening. This is a very familiar passage. Of course, the life of Joseph is a very familiar story. In fact, there's been, if you remember the play, what was the name of that play? The Coat of Many Colors or something like that? Yeah. Now that song is probably going to be stuck in some of your heads if you really know what that is. But anyway, very familiar. This is where we find our boy Joseph. If you recall from chapter 39, he has landed himself in the Egyptian's house, at Potiphar's house. And if you recall, he was accused from Potiphar's wife of being one who was going to rape her, and which lands him now in prison. One of the aspects of the commonalities that I think all of us could share in our lives, especially is kind of one of those things that we don't want to be able to share, are things that we just don't want to go through, all right? We all have that in common. We all have gone through things in our life that we just do not want to go through. Those can be minor things, those could be major things, minor things that you just don't want to do, like your car breaks down, or you have to replace dead plants. You guys know my struggle. And you have to do all of these things. Those are minor struggles. And so we have this commonality between us that we're all going to go through something in life that is going to be a minor pain, a minor issue. And then we have this thing in common where we will go through things in life that are much more painful, bigger issues, loss of loved ones, children who are rebelling, financial heartaches, all of these pretty major things that we go through in our life. And we have this thing in common that we will go through these issues. And one of the questions that we all ask, well, why am I going through this? Why did this person have to die? Why did I have to lose this kid? Why is my kid like rebelling against the Lord? Why is my marriage in turmoil? And we ask that question, why are we going through these things? And from a secular perspective, a secular worldview, the answer is, well, we don't know. There is no purpose behind the pain. The only thing that we can do from a secular worldview is just hope things get better. The thing that I find interesting for the Christian life is that there is always purpose behind the pain that we go through. This is gloriously displayed in the life of Joseph. This is gloriously displayed throughout the Old Testament and on into the New Testament. As Heather was reading from Romans chapter 5, our suffering brings us closer to Christ, makes us more into the image of God. So what we find in this story is that very thing that, although it's a very painful thing that Joseph is going through, although it is a very unimaginable painful thing that he's going through, our God is sovereignly orchestrating every detail that Joseph is going through according to God's glorious purposes. Okay? I would even venture to say that for the Christian life, that everything that you go through, God has sovereignly allowed so that and for that His glorious purposes could be made. We've got a lot of wrestling to do with that, as I'm quite sure some of you are asking many questions in your mind about some of the things that you've been going through. I want to read Genesis chapter 40. What you're going to see is God has led Joseph to one of his, I might argue, lowest points of his life. And I would argue that he did that so that he could prepare him for a greater purpose and so that God could be glorified. Okay? Genesis chapter 40, I'm just going to read some of this in little tiny bites and then we'll walk through it together. Genesis chapter 40, verse 1, it says, sometime after this, right? So he's in prison, he's with a couple of guys. The cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense to their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. So here's what's going on. These two cupbearers and this bakers, they were highly trusted officials, highly trusted individuals to the king. They end up in prison with Joseph. And this passage is going to outline for us that they begin to have these dreams. And Joseph is going to interpret these dreams. He predicts, based on their dreams, that the cupbearer will be restored. And then this other guy, the baker, will be hung. He will be executed. And so we read in verse 21, 23 of the same chapter, Pharaoh restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. A couple of lessons to be had in this is never ask anyone to interpret your dream, lest the interpretation is that you will be hanged. The other thing that I find interesting, the principle that we don't want to miss before us, is that it's a tendency for people to forget. You ever done anything nice for someone, and then suddenly you find yourself in need of something? And where is that person that you did something nice for? You know where they are? Nowhere to be found. It is a stark contrast of the human condition of how forgetful we are. The overarching theme of all of this in chapter 40, and the important principle that we cannot miss here, is before God uses Joseph in an incredible way, he is going to move him into one of his lowest moments, again, to prepare him for greater purpose. That's quite humbling, isn't it? That God in his sovereignty is going to lower Joseph to his lowest point of life in order to prepare him for a greater purpose. Isn't that interesting? And then isn't that true of us today? That isn't it in the lowest points of our lives that we find ourselves learning to trust God more? Isn't it in the lowest places of our lives where we develop more as a believer, where we are more refined in the process of sanctification? Isn't it in those lowest points where you are crying out to God? Isn't it in those lowest points of your life where you are questioning, where you are wondering, where you're diving into the Word, where you are wondering, God, are you going to move? Are you learning to trust in God more in those lowest points of your life? Chapter 40 is an incredible tell story of how in one individual where you thought you could get, it couldn't get any worse. Well, here comes chapter 4, declaring, hold my beer because I've got yet another gut punch for you, Joseph. And the gut punch that Joseph is going to encounter is none other by the sovereignty and power of God, because God is the one who is orchestrating this low point of God's life. And I already feel the question is like, how could you even suggest that God is allowing this to take place? How could you suggest that it's by God's design that someone finds themselves at their lowest point? Well, what you will find later on in this is that the purpose of the prison was redemption. The purpose of Joseph's prison was God redeeming his people. Now we got to flip through and we got to get through this. Let me read to you that kind of helps us out with this. This is one, I don't know where Robin, there's Robin. This is one you'll want to put on the set list. It's a hymn by John Newton, the guy who wrote Amazing Grace. And he wrote a hymn, and it's called, I Asked the Lord That I Might Grow. This is a great one. You guys are going to love this one and be begging Robin to have this singing every Sunday. Here's the lyrics. You didn't ask for this, but I'm giving it to you anyway. I asked the Lord, John Newton writes, that I might grow in faith and love and every grace. Again, this is a hymn to be sung. Might more of his salvation I know and seek more earnestly his face. 'Twas he who taught me thus to pray, and he, I trust, has answered prayer, but it has been in such a way as almost drove me to deep, dark despair. I hope that in some favored hour at once he'd answer my request, and by his love's constraining power subdue my sins and give me rest. Instead of this, he made me feel the hidden evils of my heart. And let the angry powers of hell assault my soul in every part. Yea, more, with his own hand he seemed intent to aggravate my woe, crossed all the fair designs I schemed, blasted my gourds and laid me low. Lord, why is this? I trembled, cried. Wilt thou pursue thy worm to death? 'Tis in this the way, the Lord replied. I answer prayer for grace and faith. These inward trials I employ from self and pride to set thee free and break thy schemes of earthly joy, that thou mayest find thy all in me. Amen. I know y'all gonna be emailing Robin right now. Like, bro, put that one on the list immediately. Newton is saying what I think we all say in trials. He's praying for spiritual growth. He's praying for deeper understanding of the gospel of Christ. And in praying these things, he hoped that God would answer his prayer in one glorious moment, in one simple solution. And God answered his prayer not in a glorious moment of spiritual ecstasy as it was. He didn't answer it in that type of way, but he answered it by allowing Newton to go through trials and suffering so that God could do something miraculous in his life. It's exactly what is happening in chapter 40 with Joseph. God is bringing Joseph, as Newton writes, to his low point of life, for God's glorious design and purposes to be revealed. One of that would be by way of redemption. Now then we cross over into the good part, and so now you can all breathe and thank God we're not talking about that anymore, because now we find ourselves in the more joyous chapter of Joseph's life in chapter 41. We read about two dreams that Joseph, it feels humid in here. Is it me? Get on back to the south, you devil. All right. Then he goes back to chapter 41, and we read about two dreams now Joseph is about to have. I'm from the south. I could say that kind of thing. The king is about to have two dreams in the same night. The first dream is about this skeletal, weird, ugly cow and how it's devouring and eating 7 well-fed, luxurious, attractive cows. And then he has this other dream, which features this 7 thin, blighted ears of grain swallowing up 7 full and healthy ears of grain. And after that, Pharaoh wakes up and he's looking and he's deeply troubled and he's looking for answers and he's wondering, is there anyone who can interpret the dreams? I wonder. You read in verse number 9 of 41, then the cupbearer said to Pharaoh, how long has it been since Joseph was in prison? 2 years. Now the cupbearer remembers. Oh, hey, there's this guy's name. And I remember my offense today when Pharaoh was angry with his servant and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. That's a funny verse. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with his own interpretation. But there is this young Hebrew that was with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dreams. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored. Other brother wasn't so fortunate, right? The baker, he was hanged. Like at this point, you're going, oh, now you remember. Remember what was one of the things that Joseph said to the cupbearer in the middle part of chapter 40? He's like, hey, brother, this is my interpretation, okay? He's like, hey, dude, don't forget me. Whatever you do, like, it stinks in here. Literally, figuratively, They're in prison. All right, this isn't like some glorious prison where they're serving you and where, you get to call mom every day or whatever it is. I don't know. I've never been to prison. I don't intend to go to prison. This is bad. And he's got this, he's like, all right, I'm interpreting dreams. Here's the deal. You don't forget me. 2 years pass. Where's Joseph? Well, he was forgotten. Isn't that what the last verse says in chapter 40? But that sorry little joker, the cupbearer, maybe if it wasn't the cupbearer, maybe the baker. But sorry God for him. He got hanged. Maybe he would have remembered. But the last verse of chapter 40, he forgot. God presses down more, strips Joseph more of himself, brings him deeper and deeper to the lowest point of his life. And finally, after 2 years, the cupbearer has this aha moment. He's like, hey, there was this Hebrew boy I remember because we had some really crazy dreams and he interpreted them. And the crazy thing is they came true. I think he could probably solve your dilemma. And we read in verse 14, then Pharaoh, he sent and called Joseph and very quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said that you hear a dream and you can interpret it. And Pharaoh describes his dreams to Joseph, and Joseph interprets them, and he explains how these two dreams are referring to the same thing, mainly that there will be 7 years of richness, plentiful, harvest. And then that will be immediately followed by 7 years of famine, of drought, of nothing. And look at verse number 33, and we're almost done with the passage, that is. Don't get too excited. He says in verse 33, he suggests his course of action here. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man. Wonder who that could be. And set him over the land of Egypt, lest Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let him gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Joseph for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. And look what happens. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Wow, a pagan guy saying this. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all of this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and placed it in Joseph's hand, clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. And he made him ride on his second chariot. And they called out before him, bow and kneel. Thus he has set him over the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up a hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Wow. I mean, just like talk about like an incredible, I mean, just a moment ago. Or we're not talking about years, like just a few moments ago, brother man was in prison thinking, could it get any worse than this? I've done nothing but follow after you, God. And look where it's led me. To a prison. This cold, I've been abandoned, I've been betrayed, I lived my life serving you, God, and look where it's led me. And then all of a sudden, this crazy turn of events takes place, and the dude, the fish-brained cupbearer, finally has this moment. If it had not been that Joseph wasn't in prison, to interpret the dreams, then none of this would have been possible. It was because of the suffering, because of the prison, that was going to lead this revolution of redemption for his people. And now we get Joseph as some sort of prime minister, right, over all of Egypt. It's the second of command. You got to understand, Egypt was likely the most powerful army, the most powerful nation in this time. I think about that for just a moment. I did some math. All right, now my math isn't good. I have an Alabama State education, so it's a little fluffy. Okay, but listen. Since creation, since Adam has come on the scene, there has been roughly 2,900 years since God created Adam. And in all of this time, God has for some reason allowed Egypt to become the most powerful nation in all the land. And now, this Hebrew boy, this favored of his father, is now second in command of the greatest empire of that era. And so we see how God has this marvelous purpose for Joseph's imprisonment. And I think that's the main idea of both of these chapters, that there is purpose in the prison. The imprisonment of Joseph was not purposeless. That it was just some fluke, that it was just, it just so happens, stance, whatever, hope it works out for you. No, God was orchestrating by his sovereignty and providence that he would allow Joseph to get at his worst and reveal to them a purpose. A few things that I would just want to, how this plays itself out with this purpose in this prison, and how I think it even applies to us, that God used this imprisonment to shape and to continue to mold Joseph's heart. God was working in the back. God was working behind the scenes, as it were. God wasn't absent from the chaos. God wasn't void of the imprisonment. God wasn't up there wringing his hands going, gee, I wonder what the next story is going to look like for this guy. No, in his lowest point of his life, God was molding him, God was shaping him, God was moving him into a greater purpose that God has for him. And yet one of the fundamental purposes God has in our suffering, is to form us, is to shape us. And he does this in a few ways. He shapes us in the suffering. He shapes us in the chaos by helping us develop a godly character. Even though, this is true of all of us, I'm sure, it's definitely true of me. Even though, it seems like when I'm going through my worst points of life, it seems like at times the worst of me actually comes out. This is why when the New Testament writes about this war among us, against our flesh and our spirit, there's this war inside of me, I'm going through all this stuff, and sometimes that brings out the worst of you. But maybe the perspective should be that when I'm going through the chaos and when I'm going through the suffering, that perhaps it is God trying to shape me and form me and refine me more into his image. I keep getting back that image of Malachi when he declares, and this is the most horrid image of what God does for his people, but he says, God is like a refiner's fire. I don't know if have you been burned physically? Now, unless you're one of those people who are like, it doesn't hurt me, you're weird, all right? But it's painful. And the refinement doesn't destroy you. It strips and it removes all of the dirt, the grind, the nastiness. Conforms us more into his image. Suffering also teaches us to rely on God's strength instead of our own. Right? You gotta imagine for a moment, when you were depleted of everything, when you were sitting in a prison cell, as we find our boy Joseph was in chapter 40 and the beginning of 41, depleted of all of his strength. wondering what was the next move. Am I going to die here? It is a call for you to rely on the strength of God, not on the strength of your own self. Suffering also, as I alluded to, from the refinement, it purges our hearts from the things that are just not of God. God removing those idols, God removing those sinful patterns, God removing all of those things as we begin to develop and trust Him more and more. Another reason that God uses this imprisonment for His purpose was for a place of redemption. And this is one that we've got to wrestle with for a little bit, because this one is a crazy idea. That God's purpose of the prison was for redemption. God's purpose of the prison of Joseph was for none other than redemption. Look at this main passage and we see from chapter 40 through 41 how God is using Joseph's imprisonment not only to accomplish certain things within Joseph and within his own heart, but to accomplish something greater, a bigger story that God was writing that was way far outside of the purview of any one of these people that are involved in this story. The reason why this was so strategic by God, and the reason why we can come to the conclusion that this was by God's sovereignty, is that we find ourselves that what Joseph says, that there's going to be plentiful, there's going to be this lush and glorious harvest, but right after that, it does come true. There is a great famine. And it is because of this, because God has him in this position. What do we know about the story in just a few chapters? In 45, who comes to visit Joseph? His brothers. And this is what they say in chapter 45. His brothers come to Egypt to buy food because they're also affected by the famine. And now do we be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here? This is what Joseph tells them. Listen to the perspective that this brother has. And now do not be distressed, he says to his brothers, or angry within yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve my life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 more where there will be no plowing and no harvest. Listen to what Joseph says and the perspective that we need to gain. God sent me before you to preserve not just me, he says, but for you a remnant on earth, and keep alive for you many survivors. I was reading that, and it was just like, I need a little Joseph in my life. I am nowhere near that. When I am going through trials, when I'm going through suffering, the disposition of most of us when we're going through those things is for us to start blaming God, to start pointing our fingers up to the heavens and say, how dare you do this to me? But look what Joseph does. God allowed the slavery. God allowed the betrayal. God allowed being accused. God allowed the imprisonment for years upon years to preserve me and to preserve you for a remnant of people. You have to ask yourself a question. Why is Genesis 40 and why is Genesis 41 just in here? Why is it so important? And what does this mean? Well, the simple answer, and I hope you see already the connection here that I'm making, is that God is rescuing, God is redeeming Judah or Joseph to redeem his people. God is redeeming his people, mainly that of Judah, of whom we skipped, right? The chapter that we skipped and said we'd come back to, which is the story of God stripping Judah at his lowest with some incredibly weird things that take place. Right? Not the nighttime story you want to read to your kids. Because kids are going to be asking a lot of questions. Mom, what does that mean? And you're like, Dad, get in here. It's strange. But again, it's a story of God stripping Judah of his lowest. And there's some incredible gospel imagery going on and taking place here. So the purpose of this imprisonment is so that God could rescue Joseph, to rescue his people, mainly Judah here. Right? Do you remember who Judah is? We discussed this weeks ago. Who comes from the line of this Judah guy? So do that connection in your own head. That God would preserve Joseph in prison to preserve for himself a remnant of people, to redeem for himself a remnant of people. To do what? To redeem me. That brings light of, it turns a light bulb in some of us when we think about this, when we go through suffering, when we go through pain, and we're wondering, why am I going through this? Perhaps it is because God has allowed you to go through that for a greater purpose, for the glory of God. What is that? In light of redemption. That's what it's for. So that the people that are around you, the people that God has placed you in, the family he's given you, the spouses he's given you, all of these things, the particular place that God has placed you in is for none other than that God would be glorified through the purpose of redemption. You hear that? What a gospel call that is for me to live my life. That I'm going to live my life, strive to live my life through the suffering so that God can get the glory through the purpose of redemption. Reminds me of Paul in Acts chapter 17 when he's speaking to the men of Athens, and he says to them, and he made from one man, he says, every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and having determined the boundaries of their dwelling place. The sovereign God has placed you in the town that he's given you, the neighborhood that he's placed you in, the home that he's given, the job that he's given you for the greater purpose of redemption, for the greater purpose of pushing out the gospel of Christ. One other final thing that we see in here from this purpose of the prison is, I can't help but to not omit this because this is a pretty cool one, is how God can just use anybody. If Joseph is a lesson, and if any of these guys that we've been studying is a lesson for us, let the lesson be, wow, God used some really crazy jokers. And that's the point. That's the point. God's not looking for people with accolades and all of these degrees and all of this, well, look what I've done. I've climbed the ladder and I've made all this money and I've done all these things. And you think God is impressed with your accolades, with your kind of climbing up the corporate ladder? No. It's funny because why on earth would God use a Hebrew boy, which we know in just a couple of chapters? The Egyptians hated the Hebrews, right? In fact, I believe it's the next two chapters over, or maybe a chapter over, where it says that they would not even eat with the Hebrew people. That's how much they despised them. The runt of the family. Not even the oldest, the runt. God uses him. Not just the runt, but the Hebrew boy in Egypt. God uses him. Let that be a breath of fresh air for some of you who feel like you're overlooked and feel like, I don't know if God will ever use me. You're doing that pattern of like navel gazing. You know what that is? You know what a navel is, right? Your belly button. It's the pattern of Eeyore. Oh, come on, Winnie the Pooh people. Oh, nobody loves me. God can't use me. I don't have the gift of teaching like he does, or I don't have the gift of singing. I don't have a platform. Woe is me. I mean, you were like a modern day Jonah, sitting under the tree with the worm eating all the leaves. Well, I guess I got to go back to Nineveh. Boo-hoo-hoo. If there's anybody that God can use, this sounds awful, but it's really good. You're the prime candidate. You, Eeyore, you are the prime candidate. Not the one with the degrees in theology, and I've got my seminary background, which those things are great. But give me a person who is passionate about the gospel over that any day. And that's the person that God uses. He uses Joseph from the pits of despair. He uses Joseph the runt. He uses Joseph, the one who is a Hebrew in the land of pagans, and now is the second in command. Don't think for one moment God will overlook you. The encouragement, my brothers and sisters, is that God will use you in a mighty way, but be careful, because he will at times humble you and bring you to your lowest, as he did Joseph, before he uses you for his greater purpose. I can't help but to look at this as I use this as more of a segue to get into communion. I can't help but to notice like some of the imagery, or more, maybe a better word would be some foreshadowing that we see here. And that, of course, is Jesus. Like I hope you see Christ in this, that there's a greater Joseph, there's a greater person in this story that's being written about. Jesus is described just like Joseph, as being uniquely loved by God, by the Son of his Father. And yet, just as God allowed Joseph to be severely tested, Jesus himself would be severely tested 40 days and 40 nights by none other but Satan himself. Just as Joseph was tempted by Potiphar's wife. You see the jealous brothers. You see the jealous brothers of Joseph and the jealous religious leaders of Jesus. You see how Joseph's brothers betray him. And we also see how Jesus himself was betrayed by one of his own. Then after that, we see Jesus was accused by false witnesses, just as Joseph was accused by this lady, Potiphar's wife. Then we see Jesus that is led to being crucified on a Roman cross, an agonizing form of execution and suffering. And yet, we see God is working through every step of the way to bring about redemption. Just as God was going to bring redemption for his people of Judah, of Jacob, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, would bring about redemption for us.